Welcome back. So in this particular video we're going to talk about some different kinds of characterizations of culture. Okay? So the first, and I've talked about this a little bit before, are what we call high and low power distance cultures. Now normally these are related from Hofstede's cultural dimensions, and Hofstede for the most part, Hofstede is a Dutch org theorist, what he's talking a lot about is national cultures. He emphasizes national cultures, but I would argue that organization cultures can either match or they can be different from national cultures. They can match or be different from industry cultures, and they can match or be different than subcultures and countercultures, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. But nonetheless, I think a lot of Hofstede's ideas do kind of match some of these ideas that he has borrowed from national culture. So national culture, ways to describe a national culture, can also be used to describe an organization culture. And so we won't talk about all of his cultural dimensions, but we will talk about high and low power distance cultures. So high power distance culture means that there's a great distance between you, the worker, and then the leader or the manager. So the manager is seen as above the leader, or excuse me, the manager is seen as above the worker, different than the worker. You know, when you talk to somebody, you know, you don't refer to them as Dave or Bob. It's, you know, President so-and-so, Dr. so-and-so, Mr. so-and-so. You know, you respect them. You know, high power distance culture is a great example would be the Army, right? You know, a general or an officer is normally seen as very different than the people that are lower ranks. You know, you don't fraternize with people of different ranks. I was explained to me, a general on an exercise I was working for him, he explained to me that generals don't eat at Burger King because it was seen in some way to be, you know, I guess generals are supposed to be so classy they don't eat at Burger King. Now they would eat Burger King, they just have their aide go in and pick up the Burger King and bring it to them, but that's another story. I understand that in Japan, you know, when the CEO gets in the elevator, everybody else gets out of the elevator so the CEO can ride by his or herself. Okay? So there's different kinds of things like that that are indicative of high power distance cultures. And again, some of that's assumptions, like generals don't eat at Burger King. Some of it's in value statements, the way a value statement is written to indicate high power distance culture. And some of it can also be embodied in artifacts. Like if the boss is in an office, you know, the corner office with the nice view all by themselves, that's an indication probably of a high power distance culture. Or if executives are on a special floor, and you know, because they're on the special floor, you as a normal employee can't get up there without an appointment, that's also a high power distance culture. You know, one of the universities where I worked, all of the presidents and vice presidents were in a different building, and you know, faculty and students weren't really allowed in that building unless they had an appointment or a reason to be there. It was a special building just for them. That's also high power distance. At that same university, you also didn't see senior leadership eating at the cafeteria. That's high power distance, right? So let's talk about the opposite, low power distance. Now stereotypically, we think of low power distance cultures like in Scandinavia, northern Germany. Other organizations have this too though. But what low power distance means is that the manager is not a quote-unquote boss, but they're a senior colleague and they've got a lot more experience and information, and so they work with you as more like a senior colleague or a coach. Okay? I understand that in some countries like in Finland, you know, workers and the executive all get, you know, they do sauna and vodka and sushi parties. It is what it is. Okay? That's low power distance. And if you want to compare a high power distance university to a low power distance university, my second university employer, the president of the university, as did the vice president of the university, went to the food court and had a big table all to themselves because they wanted students, faculty, and staff to sit there with them and tell them what was going on. Okay? The president also had a party at his house at least once a year and made sure that all the faculty got to go, and he would work the room and talk to everybody. That's low power distance because he wanted to show he was a man of the people. The vice president wanted to show that she was a person of the people. So that's low power distance. Think about another example of high power distance. Less extreme than maybe a university or the Army. Let's say that you work in an organization, this goes back to those assumptions, and your boss says something that you disagree with in a meeting. If it would be seen as inappropriate for you to speak out against the boss, correct the boss, or provide another form of solution, that's high power distance. If it's that really centralized decision making, the boss says this and you execute and there's not much discussion, high power distance. Okay? Now let's look at low power distance. Low power distance would be something like, oh, in that same organization, the boss is about to do something that's maybe not a good idea. And you can say, hey boss, can you try this? And the boss will either really appreciate the fact that you corrected the boss, or they'll have a discussion explaining their reason why that they've chosen this decision. They may not necessarily go with your suggestion, but they've at least taken the time to listen to what you had to say and explain their reasoning. So even if you don't necessarily agree with the decision, you understand why that decision was made. That's low power distance. Okay? So that's a form of culture. Now, theory X and theory Y sometimes get tied to high and low power distance cultures. In some ways, that's true. In some ways, it's not. I mean, stereotypically, we can think of theory X as in a high power distance culture with that centralized decision making, focusing on the mechanism. You do this, that, and the other. And then theory Y might go with lower power distance cultures. I mean, people think like that sometimes. Think about the Japanese companies, though, again. And within the same organization, you can have different cultures in the same one. So I mentioned that the CEO gets out of the elevator and everybody gets off. Well, the higher up people are usually kind of the more creative ones in these kinds of companies. They're high power distance, but they're also very theory Y. Whereas on the manufacturing floor in Japan, also in Korea, manufacturing is very theory X oriented, but the power distance is low because any worker is free to make suggestions on how to improve processes, and if their suggestions are implemented, they normally get things like a cash bonus and sometimes even a permanent raise. So it's not exactly a perfect one-to-one. There's lots of exceptions, so I would caution you on going down that path. We also talk about strong and weak cultures. That's related very much towards high power distance and in some ways low power distance. Because when you have an organization with a strong culture, that means everybody's a Kool-Aid drinker and everybody's kind of thinking the same way, right? That could be indicative of a high power distance organization. Everybody thinks, there's not a lot of deviation or creativity. But sometimes you also have low power distance cultures, like a lot of your tech companies and creative organizations, where people adhere to the culture. It's a strong culture. They adhere to the culture not because they're afraid of their boss or because they're afraid of their consequences, but because they genuinely love the company and they want to do good. Okay? Now, weak cultures could also be found not just in low power distance, i.e. there isn't much of a culture, so everybody's kind of going their own way, but it can also be in high power distance organizations, right? Where there's so much stress and focus on everybody that people only act out of fear of getting fired. And so that results in what we call subcultures and countercultures. So the culture is weak because there's so much fear and so many threats. So a subculture can exist within the context of a larger organization, and it could be like on a certain team, right? So one example that I think of in my first unit in the Army, I was in a missile defense unit. Our training and ops people, they all kind of looked, acted, and thought the same. It was really weird. And I was like, man, is this really even the Army? Like, what are these people over here doing? That's a subculture. There's a bunch of people maybe under one manager, and they operate just a little bit different than everybody else. It's like the quirky bunch, the quirky team, the different team. That's what we call a subculture. Now, a subculture can actually be a novel form of adherence to the overall culture. So we're a little weird over here in our shop, but we're doing it because that's the way that we support the overall organization. That's one way of doing it, okay? But the other can be a counterculture, and that's when it's a kind of a subculture that is designed normally to function in a very, very different way from the overall organization. It could be a form of adherence, but it usually is not. It's something that can undermine what everybody else is doing. Okay? And you find a lot of subcultures and countercultures in what we call heterotopias. A heterotopia is what we call a space within a place. So in other words, think of something like a task force, a temporary organization, a holographic organization. These are good examples of heterotopias. The book Lean Six Sigma for Service by Michael George and Sr., Michael George Sr. and Michael George Jr., that particular book, which is a great book, I highly recommend it, looks a lot at these heterotopias and the subcultures and sometimes countercultures that exist. So what they do in this book is they examine how a lot of large organizations will form these temporary organizations, these task forces, these heterotopias, where they cherry pick different people from across the organization to work on a specific problem. So they might take somebody from manufacturing, somebody from marketing, someone from customer research, someone from HR, and some line workers and stick them all in a room and say, this is your problem, you don't leave until you solve it. And so when people are taken out of their own little comfort zone, out of human resources, out of marketing, etc., and they're put in this room to work with other people, this creates a subculture. It's a subculture of the larger organization culture devoted to solving a particular problem. Okay? And it can be a novel form of adherence. But in some cases, if there's a counterculture, i.e. they're starting to realize that the overall macro level organization is somehow out of sync with the environment, i.e. what the customers need, or is somehow out of sync with what the workers and employees need, this counterculture can be a threat to the organization culture. Now some cultures need to change, and so that's a good thing. But either way, it's considered a form of deviance that can be a threat to the overall larger culture. You're probably thinking, and there are some examples, from your own experience. When I worked at the military post office, again when I was in the Army, one of the things I did is focused on creating heterotopias. So the post office is a weird one, and it definitely had a counterculture because the military post office is accountable to both the United States Army and it's accountable to the USPS, United States Postal Service, which is a federal organization. So it straddles two organizations. So you have certain obligations as a service member wearing a uniform and certain obligations to the federal government. And this creates really, really weird things. So sometimes what I would do is I would work with stakeholders to form kind of task forces to help them achieve what they're trying to do in a better way, right? That would be a subculture because we worked out a way to adhere to postal regulations and Army regulations in a novel way. We did it kind of off the books. It was kind of an unofficial thing, but this was a way to make us happy. But then it would also result, the post office was also a counterculture. And think about why. Sometimes I would observe people who outranked me breaking federal law, or somebody that worked for them was breaking federal law. They were violating postal regulations. And so my job as a very low officer was to point out that what they were doing was unacceptable. Here's the regulation to go with it. And this either had to be stopped or there had to be consequences associated with this. And I took a lot of abuse and a lot of threats over that because they would say, well, Army regulation says you're a lieutenant, you're going to do what I say or you're going to get punished. And I said, you don't understand. I'm exercising a federal mandate here. This has nothing to do with rank. Whenever the federal government starts writing regulations, it supersedes everything that we're talking about when it comes to handling mail. And so that was a counterculture. It was a threat to existing control. Either way, these things tended to happen in heterotopias, kind of these hybrid organizations between the military post office and then individual military organizations like a engineering company or a logistics battalion, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an unusual way to see it, but I hope these examples do illustrate my point. As always, hit that like, that thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell, and definitely post your comments down below. Looking forward to seeing you in the next video.